Unique for its beauty, a World Heritage Site, Venice is an increasingly fragile city and a victim of more extreme climate.
It's a monster, that one.
On the 12th of November 2019, a storm like none before it caught everyone off guard.
I've never seen anything like it.
But this is only the tip of the iceberg.
Ever since 1950, the amount of flooding has steadily grown.
How many more disasters will hit the city in the future? To save Venice, engineers and technicians have been working for years on an enormous project, nicknamed Mose. Will Mose be able to block the sea's rage? 11 months later, with everyone in the control room holding their breath, Mose raises its 78 barriers. Technicians, engineers, and all Venetians can breathe a sigh of relief.
For the first time in history, a sea storm has been stopped in its tracks. In 2,000 years of this city's history, incredible.
The news goes viral worldwide. Venice is finally safe. But for how long? On the horizon, global climate change is looming and is increasingly disturbing. What would happen if the Antarctic were to melt?
The water would come as high as the bell tower in Venice. Well, it's just unimaginable.
Faced with similar scenarios, climate scientists look at Venice as a large open-air laboratory where they can study the future of our planet.
If we save Venice, we can save all coastal cities.
The silence is broken by the sound of the alarm siren. An exceptional high tide level is about to arrive, 140 centimeters.
That day, November the 12th, was actually quite dramatic, that's for sure. Several days before, we realized that there would be a tidal event, that it would be quite large. But what happened? Well, that night the winds were not nearly as strong as expected. In fact, in the morning we had forecast a tide of around 140 centimeters, but it reached only 127.
That morning we said, well, if it really is 10, 12 centimeters lower than tonight, the tide won't be nearly so high.
We really weren't very worried, in the sense that, yes, we knew it, but no one was expecting what would happen next.
No strong winds were expected, and it was like this for almost 3 hours. The tide didn't rise until 9 p.m. We thought the tidal event was over.
Until 9:30 or 9:40 p.m., the situation wasn't very serious because the water was rising, but there was no wind.
At 9 p.m. something happened at sea. Apparently, the wind suddenly changed from northeast to southeast and then pointed south and more than tripled their velocity. So in turn, we increased the 150 centimeters forecast. We went up to 160, to 170, to 190. Values like this had never been seen before in the history of forecasting in Venice. 4 sounds. It was an exceptional tide. We immediately sounded the sirens. We did something that hadn't been done for many years. We continued to play the sirens over and over again.
The sirens rang out 2 or 3 times in half an hour. The water came in a flash. It rose dramatically.
The water started coming from around the doors. In fact, it started to seep in from under the flooring.
I actually saw a toilet float out of a restaurant that night. The whole bowl, it just came right out of the place.
One felt helpless. The only hope was that this situation would end as soon as possible.
The unusual aspect was the speed with which the water suddenly began to rise.
The water was rising that night very quickly. That almost never happens.
In 1 hour, the tide rose an extra 40 to 45 centimeters, reaching a height of 187 centimeters.
I'm telling you, it was crazy.
We saw 2 water buses stranded at the end of Riva degli Schiavoni. Some taxis were on the ground with their engines running. It was something unimaginable. I have never seen anything like it.
I returned in the first water taxi at 1:30 a.m. My kiosk that I had, it was all gone. Like completely gone.
There had been a very small cyclone structure that had moved into the center of the lagoon, bringing gusts of wind that actually topped 110 kilometers an hour, which was right outside San Marco. Are phenomena like this to be blamed on climate change? Well, I know for certain that a meteorological structure of this type, of this nature, in our latitudes, had never been observed.
Venetians will need to process what happened on November 12, 2019, and what future awaits the city. Antonello Pazzini is a physicist who studies climate change and its impact on the Mediterranean area. What worries him is the increasing frequency of flooding in Venice.
We know that between 1850 and 1950, periodically every decade there were between 2 and 8 high tides of more than 110 centimeters, which is a very critical threshold. Since 1950, there has been an escalation in numbers. Meaning, for example, from 2000 to 2009, we had about 50 high tides, but between 2010 and 2019, there were more than 90 of them.
This trend is quite troubling, especially considering the rising sea levels that are threatening coastal cities around the entire planet. Venice will be among the first to end up underwater. To save it, scientists, technicians, and researchers from all over the world have joined forces. Heer Vellinga is a Dutch engineer who is committed to saving big cities such as New York, Miami, and Saigon.
Well, there are many places that are vulnerable, but few places as unique as Venice. The cultural background of Venice is unique in the world.
Built on 118 little islands of mud, just a few centimeters above the water, Venice is an easy victim to variations in the sea level. It is a fragile microcosm where each climate change event is amplified. Such catastrophic flooding is certainly a wake-up call requiring immediate action. For scientists, it is a sign of a global climate crisis, and Venice is the ideal place to study the planet's future.
Venice is really a lab for the world as a whole. And now sea level is rising. Venice is the first city to be confronted with it.
The truth is, we climate scientists need a laboratory set in nature, in which to study the impacts of climate change in a manner which is much more simplified.
Luca Zaja is a scientist of the National Research Council who has studied the human impact on Venice's lagoon.
Today, there is very little of this lagoon that is natural. If we want to truly understand how this place looked at the dawn of time, we only need to look not far from here to the delta of the Great River Po, a place that to this day is still practically pristine.
The Po River Delta is a natural laboratory where researchers can observe the dynamics of a lagoon similar to Venice's, but free from the endless series of human interventions that have changed it so profoundly over time.
The Po River's delta is the ideal environment to understand how Venice's lagoon was created. On one hand, the rivers transport large amounts of sand and silt towards the sea. On the other hand, the sea currents and waves shape the sands along the coasts. This intersection leads to the formation of barrier islands, long strips of sand parallel to the coastline, which allow the formation of coastal lagoons.
Being amongst this wild nature, one has the impression of stepping back in time by a few thousand years and seeing the lagoon as it appeared at the dawn of mankind.
About 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the sea level was much lower than it is today, and this part of the Adriatic Sea was a large plain that could be crossed on foot virtually from Ancona to the coast of Split on the Croatian side.
5 million years ago, Italy was largely submerged underwater, and the Adriatic reached what is now the city of Turin. Then, during the last ice age, glaciers took over the area. The sea level dropped by around 100 meters, and the sand and debris carried downstream by the rivers transformed the upper Adriatic into a gigantic plain. But when did Venice's lagoon actually form? The answer lies in these sandy seafloors.
The great rivers that came down from the Alps actually crossed this great plain, and their beds are now quite visible across the Adriatic seafloor as they underwent a cementation process and subsequently a colonization by constructors which have created fascinating underwater structures similar to coral reefs.
Thanks to carbon-14 dating, researchers were able to pinpoint their appearance to have taken place approximately 7,000 years ago. This allows us to identify when the sea returned in this area. These young and unstable seafloors are the cause of the progressive collapse of soil in Venice and in the lagoon.
The houses behind us are slowly sinking under the sea level. This phenomenon is due to the sediments deposited by the rivers in this area, which are compacting at the rate of about 1 millimeter per year. It's called subsidence, and it is the cause of the dramatic and slow disappearance of Venice under the sea level.
One millimeter may seem very small, but over 100 years, it becomes 10 centimeters. In 2,000 years of history, Venice and its islands have sunk by approximately 2 meters. The evidence of this are the semi-submerged buildings that surface here and there, the remains of ancient monasteries, churches, ruins abandoned to their fate. As if that wasn't enough, today, another enemy is undermining the foundations of historic buildings. The traffic of boats in the canals. The large cruise ships, which pass a few meters from the shores of San Marco, could be diverted elsewhere. But not the motorboats and water buses, which cause continuous waves that relentlessly pound the foundations. Keeping a watchful eye on the state of health of the canals and docks are Fantina Madricado and a team from the Institute of Marine Studies of CNR who regularly impact of navigation on the seafloor.
Hello!
It looks like we're all set.
Everything is okay. Ready to start. Great.
Okay.
Today, together with Antonio Patrizio, she is aboard the Litas, a research boat. Today's goal is to create a bathymetric map of the Grand Canal.
Here we are at the Salute Pier, and you can see these large holes that the water buses create when they dock and keep their engines running.
Holes greater than 1.5 meters, furrows dug by the propellers of steamboats, motorboats, and transport boats, are evidence that the volume of traffic has risen to unsustainable levels. Damage to banks and foundations is so great it can no longer be tracked. These workers in wetsuits are cleaning the foundations of an ancient wall. Then they fill the cracks between the bricks with a special cement resistant to seawater. Why is this continuous restoration work necessary? Because Venice is built on mud. The foundations of churches, bridges, and buildings lay on wooden pilings driven into the muddy sediments until they reach the hardest and most compact layers. On top of the poles are double wooden planks, and on top of those, blocks of stone and bricks. The mud, with its oxygen-free environment, protects the wood from the attack of parasites. Today, however, the waves attack the foundations. The water, rich in oxygen, penetrates between the cracks, carrying away the mud, allowing for fungi, mold, and bacteria. The poles rot, putting the stability of buildings at risk. But a new, insidious danger is threatening Venice's future. March 2020. Just 4 months after the flood that devastated the city, Venice is once again brought to its knees by the invasion of a devious and invisible enemy. In the surreal silence of the canals and deserted squares, emptied by the pandemic of the new millennium, the memory of the plague epidemics that have struck it several times throughout its history come to mind.
This is the first time I've returned to Venice since the lockdown. I never imagined that I would see it in such a way. The few passers-by make it even more surreal. Yet, if there is a city that knows the devastating consequences of epidemics, it is Venice, which has had several over the course of its history.
"600 years ago, here in the island of Lazaretto Nuovo, Venetians established the first form of quarantine in history. This massive structure, after falling into disrepair, was restored in the 1970s by the enthusiastic work of a group of archaeologists. No one knows the history of this island as well as Giorgia Fazzini, project manager of Venice Lazaretti.
If in 2020 the whole planet was quarantined, it was because Venice had devised such a system on this very island. What happened was that Venice had become kind of a crossroad for international trade, and so the quarantine was devised in an effort to see that trade was able to continue without any kind of interruption. This was its mission, so quarantine and lockdown were not something meant to close things down, but rather a solution in order to continue to keep the city alive in its own interests. At that time, it was common thought that the plague affected people because they were born on the wrong day or because God was angry with them. Venice instead understood something groundbreaking, which is that the plague is contagious and spreads, thanks to the contact between people as well as between things and people.
So the quarantine was not only for people, but also the cargo of the ships?
It involved both people and things. Venice understood that it had to isolate sick people and also adopt a series of measures to reduce the possibility of contagion as much as possible.
Giorgia, this structure is fantastic and quite huge.
Indeed. It is an enormous place that one has to imagine was teeming with people. There were porters who brought goods in and out every day according to the prevention methods at the time, and all of the so-called purging measures that were put in place in order to fight the disease.
The similarities are striking between the COVID-19 epidemic and the plague that struck Milan, Bergamo, and Venice in 1630, in which a third of the population died. When it finally faded away, the Venetians, as a sign of gratitude, erected the Chiesa della Salute, whose impressive dome remains as a memory of that tragic event. Venice has always had to fight against all sorts of natural disasters: sinking, floods, pestilence. Today, the most serious threat is sea level rise, which increasingly exposes it to the mercy of the waves, especially now that the salt marshes, the muddy islands that have always protected it, are rapidly shrinking.
Barrena are really unique systems. They are in a dynamic equilibrium. As the sea level rises a little bit, they grow with the sea, when sea level rise at least is slow. If it goes faster, the Barrena cannot keep up. But then if the Barrena cannot keep up, the waves directly hit the mainland, hit the city of Venice. So these Barrena are extremely important to protect the city and elsewhere in the world to protect the coastal lands.
During the summer, the salt marshes explode with color, as well as with the calls of the many species of native and migratory birds that find refuge here in these lands.
Barrena are the cradle of evolution and the cradle of fisheries and the cradle of all biodiversity, the birds, and lots of lagoons worldwide are being used for agriculture, for shrimp fishing. So indeed, the number of lagoons worldwide is decreasing dramatically.
Pia Villinga has spent years studying the ecosystems of coastal lagoons and has become a staunch defender of the importance of salt marshes, a resilient system that behaves as a buffer between the land and the ocean, absorbing the impact of the increasing tides, but not of boat traffic. The passage of a typical transport boat is enough to generate apparently harmless waves that propagate to the shore, carrying away mud and eradicating the vegetation. Wave after wave, little by little, the salt marshes shrink until they disappear. What will be the consequences of the daily traffic that crosses the water of the lagoon? To monitor the impact of navigation on the lagoon's seafloor is the responsibility of Fantina Madricado's team. Today, they went to the lagoon to monitor the state of the seafloor, to check on the canals where large ships passing has become an issue.
Obviously, you can see the furrows due to all of the dredging. And it really is quite interesting to notice how the furrows actually correspond precisely to the current of the various ships.
The researchers' sonar reveals the damage inflicted on the lagoon in 1964, when the Canale dei Petroli was excavated. A 15-kilometer long, 200 meters wide, and 12-meter deep waterway was designed to allow oil tankers and container ships to reach the industrial hub of Porto Marghera. It dealt a fatal blow to the lagoon. In the last 75 years, the average depth of its central basin has doubled. Besides this overall deepening, there was also an increase in the volume that enters and exits the lagoon because of the excavation of the tidal inlets.
The erosive potential of these waves is very high for several reasons, like these waves move transversely, parallel to the shoreline as you see, and then transport materials, taking them away from this side here and bringing them elsewhere. This front recedes at a rate of about 4 meters per year. Slowly entire blocks collapse and are then transported by the waves generated by the ships.
On November the 4th, 1966, while the excavation of the navigable channel, known as Canale dei Petroli, was still underway, Venice was invaded by the worst acqua alta in living memory.
These images were shot in the historic center of Venice, where the damage is incalculable. Everywhere people are working tirelessly to restore the protective embankments, especially in Pellestrina and San Pietro in Volta, where the storm has broken the historic protective dams of the Murazzi della Serenissima.
194 centimeters above the mean sea level. It was the highest ever recorded. The whole world was in shock. What had caused this disaster? Many people pointed fingers at the excavation of huge canals for having eased the access of tides into the lagoon. Others accused the industrial center of Porto Marghera for extracting huge quantities of water from the aquifers, accelerating Venice's natural process of sinking. Either way, it was man who broke the natural equilibrium of the lagoon.
The history of lagoon is characterized by a lot of human interference. And maybe we would like to reverse it and give it back to nature. But that's impossible. If we would stop interfering now in the Venice lagoon, it would rapidly disappear.
While the Venetians reinforced the heavily compromised barrier islands and raised the city pavement wherever possible, teams of scientists and engineers designed the most diverse and imaginative solutions to prevent floods like those of 1966 from happening again.
All alternatives have been studied really thoroughly, but time and again we found out you need a major solution like a gate like in Rotterdam, but that's very visible, or the other one in the Eastern Schelde, or in Korea, but all of that is maybe as good, but it's more ugly, honestly. It's less fitting in the landscape.
The chosen solution, Mose, is based on an idea that is as simple as it is innovative. To place giant steel structures on the seafloor that will remain invisible until, when there is a risk of flooding, they are filled with air and raised to block the tide. Because, as is common knowledge, air is lighter than water.
We were fascinated by this unique concept offered by the Italian engineers to use the Archimedes law to lift the gates and to make the Adriatic, to push it up so that it wouldn't reach Venice.
This is one of the most complex hydraulic engineering projects ever conceived. The numbers of the Mose are impressive. 35 reinforced concrete caissons as tall as 3-story buildings. 78 mobile steel barriers anchored on the seafloor by 156 hinges. Yet today, while these works have almost been completed, it is difficult to grasp their actual dimensions because these huge structures are largely underwater.
It's like an electric Ferrari on the sea bottom. It is vulnerable, it is complex, but it is the best.
While construction work has continued for decades, amid fierce controversy about its cost and its environmental impact, scientists have realized that to save Venice, it will not be enough to create an artificial barrier to protect the city from the fury of the sea. Great climate changes are underway. From now on, we need to think about future scenarios, which are by no means reassuring.
The ocean is now rising at about half a centimeter per year. And this is reaching the Mediterranean and Adriatic as well. But also New York, and also Miami and Shanghai and Bangladesh. So worldwide we are confronted with sea level rise of half a meter to 1 meter over the next 50 to 100 years. And this is likely to continue. But it is now also about melting glaciers. And the rate of melt of glaciers like Greenland and Antarctica is very difficult to understand.
The problem is that the more we study the dynamics of ice, the more we understand that there are abrupt phenomena that occur in the melting of the ice, and of course, all this increases our forecasting ability for the future of the rising sea level.
When will all this happen? To understand this, scientists will need to travel very far. 4,000 kilometers from Venice, the international expedition, Inside the Glacier, went to explore the glaciers of Greenland. The team, led by glaciologist Francesco Saro, descended into ice caves to understand the mechanisms that lead to the melting of ice.
What the scientists want to understand is how fast this will happen. It's not a matter if it will happen or not. It will happen for sure. But the problem is how fast this will happen. The study of glaciology usually looks to a glacier just from the surface. We do not know a lot of what is going on inside the glacier. As a paleoglaciologist, we explore the caves inside the glaciers, and we discovered that in the Greenland ice sheet, at about 140 meters of depth, you can encounter really big lakes, gigantic lakes.
This unexpected discovery was repeated in each cave. More alarming was the fact that the explorations, made only a few years earlier, found no trace of this.
The ice cap is melting on the surface, but not only, also from the inside. And this is a very important and mostly unknown parameter. So this is a kind of way to understand also how weak is the glacier itself, how fast could collapse.
But the real shock for Francesco and his team comes when they discover that the microorganisms, such as algae and bacteria, thrive under the ice. We just need to break a thin layer of ice with a tip to see gas bubbles produced by their metabolism coming out.
We think about the ice cap something where life is not existing or very few is happening. But instead, we have a huge amount of processes down there due to life which produce methane and release methane. And methane is a gas that has huge impact on global warming. More melting will be meaning also more life, more release of gases. This feedback will continuously increase the potential of losing more ice and increasing the sea level rise. But the problem is how fast this will happen. We will be ready for that.
Geologists are really worried about feedback mechanisms like this methane gas suddenly expanding into the atmosphere and warming up the Earth by another 2 degrees, which would be disastrous.
We know that if the whole Greenland ice sheet would melt, we would have a sea level rise of about 7 meters.
"23 feet is a lot. In St. Mark's Square in Venice, the water would reach the lion overlooking this portal, the icon of the city.
If we are not successful in bringing down greenhouse gas emission to zero, then ice melt will continue and Antarctica will in the end fully melt. And this ice cap has so much water, it would raise the whole ocean worldwide by about 60 meters. So the water would come as high as the bell tower in Venice. Well, it's just unimaginable.
An apocalyptic scenario that in the future could transform Venice into the new Atlantis. At present, science can't accurately indicate when all this could happen. But Venice, once again, becomes an opportunity to foresee what awaits all coastal communities worldwide and hundreds of millions of human beings.
We discover new elements of this whole system almost every day. So it's difficult to predict, but we're sure that if temperature goes up, the ice melts and the water rises, and we have to do something about it.
And remember, these phenomena demonstrate the inertia. That is to say, if we act now to drastically reduce carbon dioxide, we won't see the results for 10, 20, 30 years, because carbon dioxide residence time in the atmosphere is decades.
Beyond these long-term global scenarios, what future awaits Venice in the coming decades? Now Venice's salvation is linked to the Mose, whose mobile gates will allow control of the flow of tides entering the lagoon, avoiding new catastrophic flooding. Pierre Vellinga, who has followed the history of Mose since the beginning, wanted to return to Venice to see with his own eyes the progress of this colossal project.
It's amazing to see now what we've been researching and designing for even 2 decades. It's impressive, but it's also even more futuristic than I ever thought.
Despite construction almost being complete, upon arriving at the Lido entrance, only 2 massive concrete shoulders mark the access point. To begin to see something, you have to go down many flights of stairs until you are approximately 19 meters below the sea level and enter the tunnel that runs along the bottom of the canal. It is a 1,600-meter-long complex of reinforced concrete corridors, the backbone of the Mose structure. Here are the controls, thousands of meters of cables, compressed air pipes, the actual driving force of the system.
Oh, this is the main pipeline.
The main pipe was air.
This is air, process air, right? So the air, which will go inside the gate to lift it up.
Along the tunnel, protected by watertight steel doors, we find the cabins that house these massive hinges, weighing 34 tons each, but with the precision of a Swiss watch. A technology that required years of research and work and large investments.
So this is the part who ensures the statical connection of the gate to the caisson.
Yeah, okay. I'm impressed, 78 of these rooms.
78 gates, so 156 of these rooms.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yes,
156 of these rooms with these massive structures.
Exactly.
It better last for 100 years, otherwise, it's such an investment. So this is your control room, eh?
Yes, this is the Lido control room.
And this is the cross-section.
Exactly, this is a designed cross-section.
And this is where we were earlier.
Yes, this is the tunnel.
The barriers were designed to block tides of up to 3 meters high. Until now, the tests carried out in calm sea conditions have been successful.
I'm so happy to see it all works, I've been involved already in the late 70s, and then 50 years later, it works. Good, great. It's amazing.
So now we are ready to lift them during an high tide event.
So everything is ready for the grand live debut. It is just a question of waiting for the next high tide. On October the 3rd, 2020, the Tidal Forecast Center issues a new warning. Strong Sirocco winds are coming, which might add to the astronomic high tide expected for noon.
Look, that's a monster. Look at that thing. That is 1,000 kilometers. That is no small storm. Yeah? Yes, we're publishing them to Twitter so the citizens have them, so that everybody will be able to see them.
"8 a.m., the lighthouse of Punta Sabbione, on the jetty that protects the inlet channel, is already being battered by the waves.
Today is a special day for Venice and the islands of the lagoon. Finally, the system of mobile barriers that protects Venice from exceptional high tides, like the one today, has become operative. And these astronomically high tides are bolstered by a storm surge that creates all the problems we sadly know so well.
Meanwhile, in the control room, technicians are preparing to face an exceptionally high water level of 135 centimeters, enough to flood more than 50% of the city.
Load it, okay? Malamocco, Chioggia, activate the loading sequence.
The first gates emerge from the sea, while an impetuous flow tries to enter the lagoon. At 9:52 a.m., all 78 gates placed at the 4 lagoon inlets are already completely raised. All eyes are now on the data coming from the Tidal Forecast Center.
We are at 69.
Not even the portal of the Basilica is underwater at this time. And on the open sea, we have 126.
After the initial stress, technicians celebrate the successful test on a real storm surge.
Because one can only achieve such results with great teamwork. So, thank you.
We should have recorded 120, 125 centimeters. Yet, people are wandering on a dry sandmark square. This is so amazing. We've waited for 50 years, but the truth is, it's the first time that an incoming storm surge is kept out of the lagoon inlets in the 2,000 years of the city, isn't it?
With the mobile barriers of the MOSE project now in full operation, we can finally begin to mitigate those devastating interventions that have been created by man on this ever-changing lagoon. Facing a problem that is so complex, such as that of the continuous sea level rise, we must remember that the solution, even one such as this, is only temporary.
After some fine-tuning, MOSE should be able to guarantee a peaceful sleep to Venetians for a few decades. Then, like all man-made megastructures, it will have to retire. But before that happens, scientists and engineers shall have to work out new solutions capable of facing future scenarios. In the meantime, we will all have to roll up our sleeves and plan serious actions for the future.
Today, science tells us that the causes of climate change are mainly of human origin. This is not a drama, but it is good news. Because if they were natural, we could do nothing but defend ourselves. But since we know what we have to do, and we have all the tools and all of the knowledge we need, let's do it, for Venice and for the whole world.
Sometimes people get completely hopeless and think climate change is too big to comprehend. Sea level rise, too big. COVID-19, impossible. Nature is being destroyed. I give up and I only pray. But of course, we should better think of our history. Of course, we had the Black Death in the 13th century and the Renaissance thereafter, starting actually here in Venice and surroundings. So there is always a future and there is always human ingenuity, but we have to use it as an individual and as a collective.